Hey everyone! Tonight we start with some of the worst fathers in medieval history, their terrible legacy, and their dubious parenting abilities, men who ought to have been labelled with warnings by all accounts. Please take a moment to like and subscribe to the video before you settle in, but only if you truly like my work here. King John may be familiar to you as the antagonist in all of the Robin Hood tales. You might be surprised to learn that he was also a strong candidate for the title of 13th century least emotionally available father. And that's saying a lot in a time when the majority of parenting was scolding and planning calculated weddings before your child reached puberty. After taking the English crown in 1199, John alienated almost everyone in a few weeks. The Pope, barons, nobility, his mother, and eventually his own offspring. His fathering heritage is a perfect blend of selfishness, negligence, and the odd felony murder. Let's begin with the endearing tale of Arthur of Brittany, his nephew. Unfortunately, John had a claim to the throne, and Arthur had a claim to the throne. Fury. He allegedly starved the adolescent to death in a castle prison after capturing him. Parenting advice. You've most likely gone too far if you use medieval torture to settle family disputes. However, John's dysfunction was not limited to his extended family. Henry III, his own son, inherited a country that was essentially the medieval equivalent of a burning garbage wagon due to its political instability and financial ruin. To make matters worse, John spent almost 10 years imprisoning Henry's mother, who was also his own wife. For nothing shouts domestic stability more than confining your heir's mother in a tower while you lose wars. Eventually, he was compelled to sign the Magna Carta, which he promptly disregarded because rules are for peasants, after taxing the nobles into open revolt and losing the majority of his French lands in a single outburst masquerading as a campaign. John appeared to be a despot to the outside world. To his kids, however, he was a crown-wearing, absentee landlord. He wasn't caring, he lacked wisdom. At best, he was the medieval version of a father who is away losing Normandy again, and thus misses your birthday. John thus sets the tone for the phrase, worst dad in medieval history. He weaponized fatherhood rather than merely failing at it. Parenting wasn't the only thing Ivan the Terrible struggled with. He lowered the standard to such an extent that it penetrated the very roots of Russian history. Ivan, the first Tsar of all of Russia in the 16th century, began his rule with reform, ambition, and good public relations. However, he was already in his paranoid tyrant phase when his kids were old enough to speak. Mass executions, secret police, and what contemporary specialists would tactfully characterize as serious trust issues were all part of it. Although he was the father of multiple children, his relationship with his oldest son, Ivan, was the kind of catastrophe that makes the cost of contemporary therapy seem insignificant. Their relationship was notoriously tense. According to Ivan the Terrible, the younger Ivan was popular, intelligent, and capable, all of which equated to intense suspicion. In 1581, a furious disagreement between a father and son literally brought things to a head. Why? The younger Ivan's wife, his pregnant daughter-in-law, had been brutally assaulted by Ivan the Terrible for failing to wear proper attire or for living without his royal consent. He was accosted by the younger Ivan. Voices were raised, words were spoken. The elder Ivan then became furious and, in typical overkill fashion, swung his scepter across his son's skull. His son died after falling and bleeding. The scene is even depicted in a painting. Wide-eyed in terror, Ivan held his son's lifeless body and realized that perhaps it would have been wiser to stop yelling at his kids and to refrain from striking them with metal rods. This was more than just a son's death. It was Ivan's political future dying. The time of troubles, which is as entertaining as it sounds, began because his surviving successors were frail and unsuited to govern. Dad's inability to control his temper caused Russia to plunge into anarchy, starvation, and succession issues. Ivan wasn't a better father because of his guilt. It worsened him, if anything. Up until his own death in 1584, which coincidentally occurred while he was playing chess, he increased the number of executions, incarcerations, and cases of general psychopathy, very likely cheating. Ivan receives a Lifetime Achievement Award for royal overreaction, 0 points for nurture, and full points for drama in the medieval dad rankings. The medieval parent who made sure his children learnt 2 things early was Peter of Castile, also called Pedro the Cruel, or, if you're feeling very tactful, Pedro the Just. First of all, you should never trust anyone. Secondly, your father may actually stab your uncle over dessert. The mid-14th century, when Peter governed Castile, was a difficult time for royal family gatherings, made more so by the possibility of sudden executions. After ascending to power as a youngster, he immediately gained a reputation for fusing rash violence with calculating politics. Basically, picture your father being a chainsaw operator and a chess expert. His approach to parenting will refer to it as high body count, low affection. For a medieval monarch, having many children from several mistresses was like catching Pokemon. Faintly amazing, expected, and ultimately useless if you couldn't recall their names. Peter's failure to treat them as heirs was the issue. He regarded them as political shills. Perhaps you will receive a dagger or a treaty. However, his unrelenting fixation with killing Henry of Trastamara, his half-brother, was his greatest contribution to poor parenting. Peter chose fighting over drinking and ignoring his siblings, as was the case with most medieval fathers. Real conflict. Henry was held accountable by him for intrigues, treason, and the overall misalignment of the stars. He also went beyond small-time taunts. During a contrived reunion, Peter personally stabbed Fadrik, another half-brother, in a true family dinner gone wrong. The phrase, "let's hug it out," seems to indicate, "let me hug you with a sword." So, does this leave his children dispersed, disinherited, or incarcerated? Others were married off like unwanted fruit baskets, while others were deemed illegitimate. To continue the practice of generational trauma, Peter's adversaries even threw one into prison after Peter's death. They all lost out on the throne. Peter spent his entire life attempting to assassinate Henry, his half-brother and arch-enemy. Poetry? Indeed. Preventable? Yes, too. Peter was not only a bad parent, he made being a father a violent sport. Emperor Basil I had a story about a glow-up that seems good until you realize it finishes with several stabbings and a very perplexing family tree. Basil, a peasant from Macedonia in the 9th century, ascended through the Byzantine ranks by a combination of charm, athletic prowess, and the sporadic, mysterious disappearances of his opponents. It initially appears to be a tale of rags to riches, steady boy to the emperor. However, at some point Basil turned the parenting manual upside down and concluded that assassination was simply sophisticated family planning, and that emotional attachment was optional. Let's begin with his ascent. Basil reportedly became Emperor Michael III's bodyguard, wrestling partner, and possibly lover after warming up to him. There, history becomes somewhat hazy. In the end, Michael made Basil co-emperor, which was kind but dangerously hopeful because Basil soon returned the favor by killing Michael while he was asleep and seizing complete power of the empire. Now, this does not automatically make him a bad father. Leo VI, Basil's alleged son, I say alleged, because Basil never really believed it, comes later. Basil raised Leo with a poisonous mixture of distrust, anger, and emotional detachment so thick it could be used to construct fortresses because the boy was born while Empress Eudokia and Michael III were still quite close. Basil publicly questioned Leo's authenticity, continuously undermined him, and essentially turned every father-son relationship into a live "who's the real dad" medieval version. Basil banned books when Leo attempted to study philosophy. Basil reacted to Leo's leadership qualities by locking up his buddies and treating him more like a political danger than, say, his child. To make matters worse, Basil had Leo's closest advisor tortured in order to convey a message. That message is that I should not have children since I am seriously ill. Leo apparently mourned with all the fervor of someone attending a tax presentation when Basil passed away in a bizarre hunting accident involving a stag and a servant's belt. Yes, really, climbs quite well. Bad father. Despite creating an empire, he was unable to establish a healthy relationship with his own son. Known for his cheekbones rather than his personality, Philip IV of France ruled in the late 13th and early 14th centuries. Historians concur that Philip's parenting technique gave the impression that a stone wall was emotionally accessible. Philip was focused, calculating, and renowned for his silence. Like an early model of a corporate office, his court was efficient, icy, and disciplined. Birthday cards were punishable by exile, and embraces were absolutely forbidden. In theory, he gave his 4 children, 3 sons and a daughter, crowns, castles, and tutors, but in practice, love was less frequent. Imagine the excitement of an HR performance review with royal titles. The Tour de Nesle incident, a scandal so tumultuous that it almost brought down the Capetian dynasty, is Philip's real claim to fame as a dreadful father. This is the outcome. Isabella, the future she-wolf of France and Philip's only daughter, visited her homeland after marrying Edward II of England. She observed that 2 of her sister-in-law, who were married to Philip's sons, appeared to be spending excessive amounts of time with 2 knights from the same castle while she was there. The gossip evolved into monitoring. They switched purses. In the incorrect bedroom, hairnets were discovered. Isabella winced. When I say that Philip acted, I mean medieval CSI. In a particularly graphic and public manner, he had the knights slain, the women captured, and their lovers tortured until they confessed. The princesses were put in perpetual captivity. In captivity, one perished. There might have been a covert murder. What about the sons? Philip did not precisely spare his boys, but he did publicly humiliate their wives. Philip essentially shut down emotionally and returned to micromanaging his currency reforms after the controversy damaged the royal image. He never repaired the damaged marriages or restored confidence with his family. He simply scowled more intensely and tightened his control. Philip, in his classic form. In the end, all 3 of his sons temporarily and largely disastrously ascended to the throne. It turns out that your heirs don't exactly thrive when you raise them in a royal icebox devoid of love. At the beginning, Charles VI of France aimed to be a decent king. He was popular, athletic, and attractive. He was referred to as Charles the Beloved. Regretfully, the moniker was altered to Charles the Mad midway through his reign, and for once, medieval nicknames weren't over the top. Small things, memory loss, paranoia, and the occasional outburst of yelling were the first signs. Then followed the notorious event in 1392 when Charles attempted to kill his own knights in the forest, after abruptly turning on them while they were on a march. Before being restrained, which was very likely not the team's intention, Charles killed a number of men and started having complete mental breakdowns. He once thought that if someone touched him, he would break because he was made of glass. He lost track of his own name, his job title, and, most importantly, that he was a father. Indeed, Charles had 12 of them, but he frequently failed to recognize them, his wife, or the throne during his episodes. As France fell apart all around him, he spent weeks or perhaps months living in a cloud of fantasy. Although Charles clearly suffered from mental illness, which isn't necessarily a crime, What makes him eligible for a place in the medieval Bad Dad Hall of Fame is what his collapse did to his children. Charles's children became pawns in one of the most heinous power conflicts in French history, as their mother, Isabeau of Bavaria, was always rushing to keep the court running smoothly, and their father was unfit to reign. Court factions battled over who should rule the king and, consequently, his offspring. They shuffled his boys about like royal baggage. He made desperate political deals to marry off his daughters. Growing up surrounded by shame, treachery, and English troops, one son, the future Charles VII, had nothing but catatonic silence from his father. When Charles VI passed away in 1422, half of France was under occupation. The country was in the throes of the 100 Years' War, and his son was struggling for legitimacy in a nation that hardly remembered what a stable monarchy looked like. Although Charles didn't mean to be a horrible parent, his absence, denial, and insanity created a void, and his kids had to grow up in the shadow of mayhem. The harsh dad isn't always the worst. Sometimes the worst parent is the one who just doesn't show up. Longshanks, whose real name was Edward I of England, was the type of father who valued strict discipline, conquering, and no embraces at all. In the way that only a savage medieval monarch with a sharp sword and a temper could be, he was towering, powerful, and terrifying. He is well known for both destroying nations and constructing castles. He drove the Jews out of England, invaded Wales, fought a war against Scotland, and most likely kicked over your ancestors' favourite bucket for merely glancing at him. When his son, the future Edward II, entered the room, he faced his biggest obstacle, not on the battlefield, but in the nursery. Edward II was everything that Edward I was not. He was an artistic, sensitive, and emotionally expressive person who liked poetry and music more than military exercises. The court and his father disapproved of the male companions he surrounded himself with, and he showed a worrying lack of interest in invading things. This personality conflict was a recipe for disaster. In addition to disapproving of his son's way of life, Edward I was appalled. He often threatened to take away his inheritance. Edward II's father publicly questioned whether his son was suitable to reign and deported Piers Gaveston, his favourite friend, when he refused to leave him. Consider a conversation between a father and son in which the father brings an army. Edward I degraded his son in public. He probably scared him in private. No touching letters or special times of bonding are documented. They pictured themselves glaring at one another while seated at opposing ends of a war council. Additionally, Edward I gave forceful rather than romantic final instructions in 1307 as he was dying. If the fight went on, he gave the order to have his bones taken into combat against the Scots. Normal dad stuff, you know. Following his death, Edward II ascended to the throne and immediately performed all the things his father would have detested. His own wife and her lover overthrew him after he brought Gaveston back and mishandled the realm. Even though the bar was low, he stumbled over it. John of Bohemia was a king, a knight, a crusader, and, regrettably for his kids, a crown-wearing adrenaline addict. John, who was born in the early 14th century, was one of those fathers of the Middle Ages who believed that being a parent meant leaving your children in a number of battle zones and with a flashy title. He married into power, became King of Bohemia in 1310 and had several children, including his most well-known son Charles IV, who would go on to become the Holy Roman Emperor. Growing up under John of Bohemia was like being raised by an especially aggressive game of Risk, so it's a miracle Charles turned out functioning. John did not live in Bohemia for the majority of his life. He hardly gave it any thought at all. Sometimes for honor, sometimes for political reasons, and sometimes simply because it was Tuesday, he liked to gallop throughout Europe on different military operations. While John fought his way across France, Italy, and the Low Countries, He pawned off his governing responsibilities and his children, leaving infant Charles to be raised by strangers. He was aloof as a father. Perhaps he should not have done that as a role model. However, John's triumphant conclusion at the Battle of Crécy in 1346 best encapsulates his reputation as a dad. John was totally blind by that time, not figuratively, but literally blind. For most individuals, this would be a good reason to retire. In order to ride in one last flash of glory, John regarded it as the ideal chance to surge into battle on horseback, tied between two other knights. And he did, straight into an English arrow war. Obviously he died. Not before he became a legend of chivalry and abandoned his adolescent son to inherit a war-torn realm with no forewarning, no fatherly advice, and a legacy to uphold that literally involved fighting on horseback. John had a straightforward conception of fatherhood. Take risks, disregard your kids, and pass away in a way that will ensure poets will quote you, but your descendants will curse you. When you consider that Charles IV had to unlearn what his father had never taught him, it becomes even more remarkable that he would go on to become one of the most successful kings in European history. Most famously, William the Conqueror transformed England into his own remodeling project after winning the Battle of Hastings in 1066. However, he also wrote one of the more problematic chapters in medieval fatherhood while he was busy rewriting British history. William gained power by battle, intimidation, and a suppressed sense of love. He was born illegitimately, the son of a duke and a woman who was politely described as not his wife. He didn't give a hug. He won. With his wife Matilda, he had at least 9 children, including 4 sons who all aspired to be king at some point. William, regrettably, possessed only 1 throne and was severely incapable of speaking without yelling. He left Normandy to his eldest son, Robert Curthose, whose nickname loosely translates to short pants, which is probably not how you want to be remembered. But William was hesitant, perhaps because Robert was impetuous, conceited, and had once incited a street fight with his own brothers. Traditional sibling connection. Eventually, Robert asked for additional authority. "No," William answered. Robert objected. His son was sheltering in a castle, which William besieged. He did indeed harass his own child, the medieval equivalent of using trebuchets to ground your child. Before realizing who it was, Robert even unhorsed and injured his father during one combat. William's response? Complete rage. It was embarrassing to be knocked off your horse by your own son, not because of the injury. Though he never really trusted Robert again, he finally came to forgive him. Rather, William made a clumsy division of his domains. Robert received Normandy, William Rufus, his second son, England, and everyone else received some land and psychological wounds. Decades of civil war, brother-on-brother conflict, and at least one royal murder mystery were all brought on by the division. William left a legacy of anarchy that outlasted him by generations because he was unable to control his sons or teach them how to rule without the use of swords. To put it briefly, William the Conqueror established a kingdom but neglected to establish a functional family. Crowns, castles, and the unresolved anger of a father who parented as if he were still on the battlefield were passed down to his children. As far as names go, Bold doesn't exactly inspire gentle parenting, and Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, spent his whole life attempting to live up to his moniker. If nothing else, it calls for drama, which Charles provided time and time again, loud and clear. Charles was born in 1433 and inherited the Duchy of Burgundy from his father Philip the Good, who was, as his name implies, a very competent man who left him a vast fortune, cities, armies, political connections, and, regrettably, expectations. Mary of Burgundy was Charles's only child, and his parenting style was a cross between medieval helicopter parent and chess master. He was anxious because he had no boys, and he threw all his dynastic aspirations into Mary as if she were a medieval spreadsheet. Charles concentrated on growing the Burgundian state by inciting conflicts with almost everyone, rather than training her for leadership. He sought to push past whatever borders that the Holy Roman Empire, France, or the Swiss had. With Mary patiently waiting to inherit it, he thought he could build out a glittering new kingdom for himself. This scheme, spoiler alert, failed. Yes, Charles was brave, but he was also careless. He insulted allies, underestimated all of his enemies, and fought unnecessary fights. His latter years were spent on a never-ending military tour, culminating in the glorious catastrophe of the Battle of Nancy in 1477, where Charles was killed after charging headlong into the Swiss army. Days later, his body was discovered frozen in the snow, half-eaten by wolves, a postscript that historians agree is never a good way to start a parenting resume. What is the true tragedy? Mary, who was just 19 years old, was left to tidy up the mess. She was compelled to marry into the Habsburg dynasty in order to live because she had no preparation, no strong connections, and all of the main European powers were now circling like vultures. This decision altered the direction of European history and turned Burgundy into a battlefield for generations. There was no legacy left to his daughter by Charles the Bold. He left her with an army of adversaries and a smoking diplomatic crater. He desired to be known as a king. Rather, he is remembered as a warning story and perhaps as wolf food. Had he lived today, Alfonso XI of Castile would have had his own reality program, akin to The Royal Bachelor, Iberian edition, or Keeping Up with the Illegitimates. Alfonso, a talented military leader who ruled in the first half of the 14th century, fought off Muslim forces during the Reconquista for a large portion of his reign. He was decisive and effective in the battlefield. However, he was a resoundingly bad father at home, particularly if your name wasn't Leonor of Guzman. Let's clarify. In order to maintain the integrity and political effectiveness of Iberian alliances, Alfonso wed Maria of Portugal, a suitable royal marriage. Alfonso, however, showed no interest in his wife. He was thinking of another woman, Leonor of Guzman, a noble woman who became his confidant, mistress, and eventually mother of 10 of his children. Not 2, not 4, but 10. 10. On the side, he was forming his own soccer squad, nor were these children hidden. At court, Alfonso showed them off. They were given titles by him. He bequeathed estates to Leonor. He handled it all as though it were an Instagram feed from the Middle Ages. My mistress and I are shown here. I'm promoting her sons here. This is my real queen pouting in the distance. Maria was clearly not pleased with this. Following Alfonso's unexpected death from the Black Death in 1350, the true issue arose. At the age of 15, his legitimate son with Maria, Peter I of Castile, spoiler alert, Peter the Cruel, ascended to the throne and was enraged by his father's partiality. His first significant move was to exact revenge on his mother. Not in a courteous or discreet manner, Peter had Leonor of Guzman imprisoned and subsequently put to death. In public, it was vicious. Dad's incapacity to keep family and statecraft in separate bedrooms caused a civil war to simmer for years between Peter's followers and his half-brother's children, Leonor. Alfonso XI was neither absent nor abusive. His presence was too much in the wrong areas. He cherished his illegitimate sons, loved his mistress, and left his real heir with nothing but bitterness and an impending civil war. Yes, a powerful monarch, but as a father. Alfonso receives a lifelong subscription to medieval family drama, full points for reproduction, and 0 points for judgment. One of those kings who received far more publicity than time spent as a parent is Richard the Lionheart. His involvement in the Third Crusade, complete with strength, swordplay, and dramatic horseback stances made him a living legend after he was crowned King of England in 1189. Regretfully, Richard earned a place on the list of the worst medieval fathers, mostly by not trying, while he was out securing glory in the Holy Land. Now, some would argue that Richard is ineligible because he has never had any legal children. Let's take a moment, though. He chose to have no legitimate children. Berengaria of Navarre was his wife for many years. They even shared a room for a few days. However, his interest in her was about the same as his interest in growing vegetables, far away, abstract, and totally without water. Philip of Cognac was one of his illegitimate sons, whom he hardly acknowledged before easily forgetting about in terms of inheritance. No estates, no titles, no public recognition, a royal son. Welcome to absentee parenthood with a side of awkward silence, which is Richard's style. However, if you include his roles as a son, brother, and uncle, Richard was a master of treachery even there. He attempted to outmaneuver his siblings, rebelled against his father, Henry II, and left the English coffers so depleted by ransom payments and crusade expenditures that his brother John had to squeeze the peasants dry to keep the lights on. Although Richard was only in England for around half of his 10-year reign, he was able to include the whole realm in his own military ambitions. Even though he didn't have children, he treated the country as a whole, spoiling it, ignoring it, and leaving it to pick up after him. Shortly after Richard's passing, his illegitimate son, Philip of Cognac, vanishes from the annals of history. No mention, no land, no claim. A father too preoccupied with being immortalized in tapestries to see another royal shadow. Richard could therefore command armies, create myths, and appear as a god on coins. But as a dad, he was too lazy to even draft a will. Louis XI of France, a guy so neurotic that he preferred sending letters by carrier pigeon because he didn't trust human messengers, would result from combining Machiavelli with an overzealous helicopter parent and crowning him. It's just typical dad energy, you know. Louis, who ruled in the 15th century, is most remembered for transforming France into a centralized, bureaucratic apparatus that was controlled by threats, bribery, and spies operating behind closed doors. To appear modest, he dressed simply, but don't be duped. Like a royal puppeteer with trust difficulties, he was tugging all the strings in the realm. Louis only had one son left, Charles VIII, who lived to adulthood. To put it mildly, their connection was more that of warden and hostage than father and son. One day, Louis XI feared Charles will question his authority. What then did he do? Motivate him, get him ready to take charge? Obviously not. He kept him to himself. Charles received only enough schooling to read royal decrees, but not enough to create his own, was raised away from the palace, and was constantly watched over. Louis had no desire for a successor. He desired a puppet that wouldn't probe too much. He kept Charles out of all political decision-making and regularly replaced his domestic staff in case they became too friendly. Louis even contemplated taking away his entire inheritance at one point for simply responding. Classic family bonding, you know. Even after Louis became ill, he continued to deny Charles any true power. Rather, he used a mix of letters, gossip, and desperate micromanagement to try to rule from his deathbed. Louis was more concerned with managing his legacy than he was with reassuring his frightened and unprepared teenage heir, even as he lay dying. Charles VIII was a sheltered 18-year-old who had no idea how to govern a country when he finally ascended to the throne in 1483. This directly contributed to some of the worst political and military choices made in early modern France. Through deceit, secrecy, and pure paranoia, Louis XI governed. He was astute as a ruler. He was the human equivalent of a locked door, emotionally inaccessible and pathologically distrustful as a father. The Merry Monarch, as Charles II of England was called, Sounds nice until you think about how much time he spent drinking, gambling, and gleefully avoiding anything that looked like duty, including parenting. The nation had grown weary of Puritanism by the time Charles returned to the English throne in 1660, following years of exile and a regrettable detour known as the English Civil War. As a result, Charles revived the party, theatres reopened, wigs grew taller, and court life was reduced to a protracted royal after-party. Charles II. Charles became preoccupied with having children, not with ruling. Queen Catherine of Braganza was Charles's wife, but he never had any legal heirs. Despite this, he went on to become one of the most successful babysitters in British royal history. Actresses, duchesses, and one woman who allegedly posed as a milkmaid to entice him were among the 7 mistresses he acknowledged having at least 12 illegitimate children, since apparently that was a thing. But his parenting essentially stopped when he acknowledged them. He lavished them with allowances and titles, such as Duke of this and Earl of that, before leaving them to be raised by their mothers or well-paid nannies. Fatherhood was like a real estate portfolio to Charles. If they don't cause a scandal, diversify, give them a fancy name, and check in once a year. Among many other things, he was known to joke, "I am the father of my people." He wasn't mistaken either. His daughters and sons filled European courts, agitated dynastic conflicts, and in one instance started an uprising. That would be Charles's illegitimate son, James Scott, Duke of Monmouth, who ended up with his head on a spike after deciding he deserved the throne. Royal edition of father-son connection. Aside from ostentatious titles and embarrassing paternity references, Charles never truly coached his kids or prepared them for much more. His fatherly legacy was a concoction of charisma, carelessness, and nebulous aristocratic sneering. His parenting style was lavish, ornamental, and extremely avoidant, and he reigned amid a period of recovery, controversy, and excess. Louis XIV was more than just a ruler, he was France. As the Sun King, he transformed himself into a living god in silk shoes and shone in the middle of Europe, while everyone else cautiously, anxiously, and ideally with powdered wigs, circled him. He was the longest reigning monarch in European history, having ruled for 72 years. That's plenty of time to establish an empire, oversee nobles, and, most importantly in this case, damage your children. Louis had at least 16 illegitimate offspring from different mistresses in addition to his one legitimate son, the Grand Dauphin. Many of these he later legitimized since, after all, why not distribute noble favors like party favors? Louis was now a parent who was everywhere, not just absent. He was in charge of everything and hovered. Imagine your father assigning you your political alliances before your voice changes, rather than reading you bedtime stories. Louis's only surviving male heir, the Grand Dauphin, was raised at Versailles, the most opulent prison in the world, complete with marble, fountains, and spies. It's odd when your position is practically next king, so Louis didn't trust him with any actual power. Louis would subvert the Dauphin's judgments, delay his education, or just disregard his advice whenever he attempted to assert himself, gently reminding him who the real son in the room was. No Dauphin ever held power. He passed away before his dad. So did the son of the Dauphin, as well as his son. Indeed, Louis XIV outlived 3 generations of successors, in part due to his insistence on tightly containing power, which caused emotional anemia in his family. Louis's legitimated children, however, weren't exactly brought up to oppose him. As strategic pawns in silk shoes, they were adorned, displayed, and married into important noble houses. While some of them faded into the background, others were bestowed with ridiculous levels of prestige. Most never ventured to try to outshine him, and none were permitted to do so. Louis wasn't careless or aggressive. Worse, he was oppressively dominant. He brought up sons and grandsons who spent their entire lives bowing down to him and were clueless about what to do after he was gone. The ancient Babylonians were looking to the sky for answers long before satellites, Doppler radar, or hourly forecasts on your phone. And not merely out of idle interest, they saw weather forecasting as a life-or-death situation, not a luxury. The ability of these ancient people to discern the signals of the heavens was crucial for irrigation, crops, harvests, and even the survival of cities along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Baru, or Babylonian priests, assumed the function of early meteorologists. However, their data was actually inscribed in clay, and their weather app was the open sky. Discovered from the remains of cities such as Nineveh and Babylon, thousands of cuneiform tablets include long-term observations, sky patterns, and weather omens that have been passed down through the ages. Nor were these hazy horoscopes. These individuals kept a record of what transpired on specific days of the month when lightning struck or when clouds developed in a particular manner. Something cloudy in the west? Red skies at twilight, thunder from the north, an omen of war, impending flood, probably divine vengeance, or at the very least, a warning to brace for crop failure. A crescent moon that gleamed too brightly was not merely beautiful, it was a significant sign, and the priests would use earlier omens to guide their decisions. Here's the twist, though. Even if it all sounds magical, a surprisingly large portion of it was grounded in experience and observation. The Babylonians observed repeated weather patterns over centuries that were connected to solar occurrences, planetary alignments, and lunar phases. Probabilistic reasoning developed from their weather omens. On the ground, Y typically followed X if it occurred in the sky. How did they monitor these occurrences? The vistas were unhindered and perfect for observing cloud formations, sunsets, lightning patterns, and celestial motions. So they scaled enormous ziggurats, those famous temple structures. Imagine having trained eyes and scanning the horizon from atop a stone mountain, searching for messages from the gods as well as clouds. The weather was frightening, political, and spiritual to the Babylonians, in addition to being natural. Your people may go hungry and your city might collapse if you missed a celestial omen and your barley harvest failed. The strain on these observers of the sky, literally astronomical. They were creating something startlingly similar to science, even though they were surrounded by myths and gods. The annual flooding of the Nile was the most significant weather occurrence in ancient Egypt, not rain or sunshine. This flood was a blessing rather than a catastrophe. Without it, fields would dry up, crops would not grow, and starvation would threaten. However, the timing had to be perfect. It would be impossible to plant if it arrived too soon. The growth season would be lost if it were too late. How, therefore, could the Egyptians anticipate the impending flood? They raised their gaze to the stars rather than the clouds. In particular, the brightest star in the night sky, Sirius, rising heliacally. Sirius would rise just ahead of the sun on the eastern horizon each year, just before dawn. For the Egyptians, this was a celestial alarm clock in addition to being a lovely sight. The Nile would start to swell within days of its arrival. This was not something they happened to discover by chance. Our watchers, or Egyptian priests, had been monitoring Sirius and other stars from their temple observatory for generations. To measure time and star positions, they employed water clocks, tall columns with shadow lines, and even tiny handheld gadgets. Agriculture was their aim, not abstract astronomy. People's lives were at stake. The Egyptian New Year, a holy period of rebirth closely associated with the flood, coincided with Sirius's ascent. They thought this cosmic order was governed by the gods. Isis, the goddess of magic and life, was linked to Sothis, the godlike Sirius, who shed tears into the Nile. The star provided the warning, but the mythology provided the interpretation. These astronomical observations served as the foundation for their renowned 365-day calendar system. The Egyptians were able to predict annual cycles with remarkable accuracy because they focused on solar and sidereal time, while other ancient cultures were preoccupied with the moon. Additionally, nilometers, stone columns positioned in the river to track water levels, were used to measure the flood when it did occur. Priests would warn of starvation if the flood was too low. They feared disaster because it was so high. However, pharaohs celebrated the divine order of the heavens by holding festivals when the time was appropriate. To put it briefly, Egypt did not depend on weather predictions. They depended on a cosmic dance between the river that provided them with life, the gods, and the stars. They just waited for Sirius to rise in order to make predictions about the future. Ancient Andean farmers had to deal with a harsh reality up high in the rocky Andes, where the air is thin and the clouds cling to rocky peaks. Survival depended on the weather. They had to create their own systems, though, as there were no year-round stars or vast rivers like the Nile. Surprisingly, some of their most reliable weather forecasters were furry, hoof-footed, and four-legged. In order to anticipate changes in the weather, farmers in the Andean highlands closely observed the behavior of llamas, alpacas, and even guinea pigs. A cold snap might be approaching if llamas shifted their grazing habits or rolled violently. It was occasionally thought that guinea pigs were warning of impending storms when they were more agitated than normal. The Andean people thought that because animals were more sensitive to the soil, they could detect minute changes in the environment before people did. It was more than just animals, though. These societies, particularly the Quechua and Aymara peoples, blended landscape knowledge, deep sky lore, and animal observation. They would, for instance, gaze at the Yanafuyu, or black clouds, which are dark areas of the Milky Way that are visible at particular times of the year. These outlines that resembled clouds were composed of cosmic dust rather than stars. Additionally, Andean sky watchers thought that their shapes foretold when it would rain. A bigger, deformed, or weak llama figure in the sky indicated an abundance of water. There would be a drought. They looked at the snow lines on neighboring mountains as well. An excessively dry season could be predicted if the snow melted too quickly. It might indicate floods if it held on to the summits for longer than usual. Reciprocity with nature served as the foundation for the entire Andean worldview. The weather was something you bargained with, not something you controlled. To placate the spirits said to reside in the weather systems, rituals and sacrifices like as pagos a la tierra, or payments to the ground, were carried out. It was all about timing. Planting corn and potatoes required careful attention to seasonal cues. The crops would decay or freeze after a few weeks off. Accuracy was more important to Andean farmers than production. It was the difference between famine and a full belly. Therefore, the Andean peoples looked at animals, shadows, and sacred mountains, while the Babylonians read the clouds and the Egyptians watched the stars. Although their equipment differed, their goal remained the same: to live in a world where your destiny was determined by the skies and the earth was constantly whispering, if you could hear it. The weather was more than just a natural phenomenon in ancient China. The harmony of the cosmos was reflected in it. The emperor was more than a king. He was entrusted with preserving harmony between the earth and the heavenly order as the Son of Heaven. It wasn't merely bad luck if the land was hit by drought or the skies suddenly grew gloomy. It indicated that there was a spiritual misalignment. The stakes were political as well as agricultural. Chinese weather forecasting combined intellectual cosmology with natural observation. The idea that the 5 elements, wood, fire, earth, metal, and water, interacted with the yin and yang energies to affect everything, including the weather, was the foundation of it all. A drought was more than just a period of dryness. It suggested an excess of yang energy, a sudden storm, or an imbalance in the water element. However, the Chinese observed rather than merely theorizing. Scholars and court astronomers carefully documented trends in rainfall, seasonal temperatures, cloud formations, and wind direction. These documents date at least to the Shang dynasty, circa 1600 BCE, when oracle bones were employed to predict the weather and royal affairs. Fires were used to break tortoise shells, and the lines that emerged were used to forecast storms or rains. Clouds were very significant. They were classified as indications of the celestial dragons by the ancient Chinese, not cumulus or cirrus. The forces of water and weather, particularly rain, were symbolized by dragons. A cloud in the east that coiled like a snake, that meant rain and good fortune. Conversely, red clouds at sunset were frequently interpreted as signs of conflict or instability. They even created the first weather instruments. They were utilizing crude wind vanes and water clocks by the Han era. Centuries before their European counterparts, the Chinese would go on to create tools like the seismoscope and early rain gauges. It wasn't just a tragedy when things went wrong. For the emperor, it was an existential crisis when locusts followed droughts or floods destroyed villages. Revolts might result from these occurrences because the populace would interpret them as evidence that heaven had revoked its mission. The sky were law, not merely nature. Therefore, the Chinese had their own system, a union of empirical observation, philosophical balance, and dragon cloud poetry, even if they didn't rely solely on the stars or animals. And you had best pay attention to what the wind was whispering if you wanted to be in charge of China. Weather forecasting in ancient Greece started to diverge from the gods and moved toward what we would now recognize as rationality. The Greeks did not completely give up on divine explanations, however. Zeus continued to hurl thunderbolts. However, a few intellectuals started posing risky queries. What if natural laws rather than temperamental gods controlled the skies? Aristotle, Anaximander, and a group of early thinkers attempted to explain weather without the help of God. One of the first, Anaximander, postulated that the sun's evaporation of earthly moisture was the origin of rain and wind, a theory that wasn't all that dissimilar from reality. Next came Aristotle, who essentially penned Meteorologica, the classic weather textbook. Aristotle described more than just rain and clouds in Meteorologica. Based on discernible patterns, he attempted to categorize every aspect of nature, including winds, earthquakes, lightning, and even celestial events. He maintained that storms, snow, and heat waves were the result of the many ways that air, water, earth, and fire interacted. Yes, part of it was incorrect. Comets, he believed, were dry exhalations that ignited. However, the endeavor itself was groundbreaking. In contrast, Greek farmers planted their olives before Aristotle's lectures were over. They depended on knowledge based on the calendar that had been handed down through the ages. The Works and Days by Hesiod, a lyrical farming handbook composed in 700 BCE, is a well-known example. It provided farmers with information on when to plant, when to harvest, and what symptoms to look out for. Winter was on the horizon if cranes were heading south. It was time to trim vines if Orion woke up early in the morning. The Greeks, particularly sailors, were also keen observers of wind patterns. Voyages could be planned because the Etesian winds, which were typical summer winds in the Aegean, were predictable. These patterns were taken into consideration while building harbors, trading routes, and even temples. More philosophical conjecture coexisted with this type of empirical, experience-based knowledge. Indeed, omens were still used, especially by those in rural areas. A farmer could still get chills from a moon ring or a howling dog at night. However, the Greeks took a risky move in contrast to their neighbors. They thought it was possible to study nature rather than only worship it. Predicting the weather in ancient India required an understanding of enormous cyclical processes rather than merely scanning clouds. One factor was crucial to the subcontinent's agriculture: the monsoon. Crops would collapse if the rain came too little or too late. Entire settlements would be destroyed by floods if they occurred too soon or with too much intensity. One of the earliest and most intricate systems of seasonal prediction was born out of this fragile equilibrium. The Vedas, holy writings created more than 3,000 years ago, contained the oldest weather legend in India. In addition to praising the gods, these songs, chants, and rites preserved generations' worth of observational wisdom. Indra, the deity of rain and storms, was one of the most significant gods. With his thunderbolt, he unleashed monsoon floods while riding the clouds. The rains arrived when Indra was happy. Droughts came when he was furious. The Vedic seers, however, were not docile worshippers. They also paid close attention to ritus, or seasonal cycles. 6 ritus, each associated with particular meteorological shifts, comprised the Indian year. Farmers discovered how to correlate the arrival of monsoon rains with specific blooming bug patterns and bird migrations. For instance, an early blooming katak flower indicated the likelihood of intense rainfall. Farmers interpreted frogs croaking more frequently at night as a surefire indication that the wet season was approaching. Even more exacting astronomical frameworks were included in the later, ancient Siddhantic literature. In order to predict weather events, scholars such as Varahamihira wrote manuals in the 6th century CE that combined astrology, star movements, and environmental cues. Varahamihira described more than 100 rain prediction signs in his book Brihat Samhita, ranging from the color of the sky at daybreak to the motions of ants and snakes. Neither were these hazy forecasts. Solar and lunar calendars, planetary conjunction analysis, and long-term sky observation were all used in monsoon forecasting. The objective was to live in harmony with the weather, not merely comprehend it. These seasonal insights were frequently used to schedule festivities, agriculture, temple construction, and even royal choices. Long before any European settlers brought a barometer, indigenous peoples in North America's vast and diverse environments evolved very localized weather prediction systems. Native American tribes had a remarkable ability to tune into their surroundings, whether they were in the Arctic tundra, the plains, deserts, or coastal woods. Because forecasting is survival when you're living off the land. Naturally, there was no one standard system that applied to all tribes. Every community reacted to its unique surroundings. Observing the behavior of buffalo herds was a crucial signal for the plains tribes, such as the Lakota and Blackfoot. A storm was thought to be approaching if the animals suddenly changed their grazing pathways or gathered together. Seasonal changes were sometimes predicted by the flight patterns of birds, especially geese, hawks, or ravens. A low, swift flight was usually an indication of an impending storm. An ascending, winding flight, the weather is fair. Living in one of the driest areas of the continent, the Hopi people of the American Southwest depended on both animal behavior and astronomy. Certain insects, such as ants, constructing abnormally tall mounds, were seen to portend impending rain. The rise of important constellations also served as a guide for the Hopi calendar. It was time to grow maize when the Pleiades appeared at morning. The Hopi employed the skies to direct agriculture, much like the Egyptians did with Sirius. The Haida and Tlingit, meantime, kept vigil over the sea in the northwest Pacific. The movement of schools of fish, the color of the water, and even the texture of the morning fog were all parts of a natural puzzle. Are whales showing up earlier than normal in the season? There could be a severe winter ahead. Is salmon going to be late? It was going to be a dry summer. Some tribes combined spiritual traditions with environmental awareness to practice ritual forecasting, which went beyond simple observation. Cherokee shamans used cloud form interpretation in holy rites to predict the next planting cycle, while certain Iroquois groups sang specific weather songs to honor the spirit of thunder. Intimacy with nature was the commonality among all these methods. In the context of contemporary science, this was not a weather forecast, it had to do with the weather. Belief was not distinct from observation. It was a component of a reciprocal worldview in which the sky, animals, and people were all considered family. The ancient Polynesians, who lived far from any continent strewn throughout the Great Pacific, created one of the most incredible weather forecasting and environmental navigation systems in history. These mariners did more than forecast the weather for farming. They accomplished this while traveling thousands of miles in open canoes without any written language, tools, or charts. How did they get it through? Like a book, they read the water. From an early age, Polynesian navigators or wayfinders learned to observe minute variations in wind patterns, wave refraction, cloud formations, and even seabird flight paths. A competent navigator could detect the approach of a storm based on the subtle rhythmic movement of the swells beneath the boat, rather than on thunderheads or gloomy skies. An abrupt shift in the horizon's color or the air's aroma could indicate the approach of a squall. Clouds were also important. Some cloud forms, such as cumulus clouds that developed over islands during the day, were employed for local weather forecasting, in addition to land location. In the morning, a cloud with a sharp vertical structure could indicate bright sky. Rain and stormy seas might follow if it leveled out and grew darker in the evening. There were the stars after that. In addition to admiring the stars for their beauty, Polynesians learned dozens of star routes that allowed them to determine their location and orientation by memorizing the complete celestial sphere. However, the seasons were also hinted to by those same stars. In regions of the South Pacific, Antares' rise shortly before dawn marked the beginning of the cyclone season. Wind movements and rainfall patterns were closely linked to the rising and setting of the stars. Their knowledge was ingrained in songs, chants, and oral histories rather than being recorded in writing. It was more important to learn patterns and repeat them until they became instinctive than it was to memorize formulas. Weather signs were incorporated into the course of these living maps. The hue of the ocean was a clue too. Water that abruptly turns from deep blue to greenish may indicate shallows or coral reef, but it could also indicate warmer currents and a higher risk of storms. Every little detail counted. Every shift in the natural world was a message. It's easy to forget that the weather wasn't anticipated for the majority of history as we browse through weather apps and look at satellite photos before venturing outside. People felt, saw, and feared it. Nevertheless, humanity were able to construct entire survival systems from the heavens, the soil, the stars, and even the nearby animals throughout the ancient world, from Babylon to the Andes. Intimacy was the commonality throughout all these old forecasting customs. Weather prediction wasn't some far-off scientific abstraction, whether it was a Babylonian priest standing atop a ziggurat interpreting thunder, or an Andean farmer observing the behavior of a llama. It was intimate, it had ancestry, it was also urgent. These old systems have a surprising amount to teach us about modern meteorology, which is based on physics, data models, and technology. The Egyptians effectively found a seasonal astronomical cause when they connected the flood to the rise of Sirius. The Chinese classified cloud varieties and monitored wind patterns. In books that are still studied today, Indian academics recorded climate behaviors with startling accuracy. Despite its shortcomings, Aristotle's Meteorologica even served as a key text for centuries in Western philosophy. However, precision isn't arguably the most timeless lesson to be learned from the ancients. It has to do with attunement. These societies respected the weather in addition to forecasting it. They incorporated it into politics, poetry, ritual, and religion. It could be worthwhile to restore the idea that weather was something that communicated, rather than merely something that happened. We might use a little of that historic humility as we deal with the current climate problem, which includes rising temperatures, unpredictable rainfall, and vanishing seasons. The Babylonians did not believe they were in charge of the skies. The Polynesians made no attempt to control the sea. They listened, adjusted, and viewed nature as a collaborator rather than an issue. Whether it will rain on Thursday of next week can be determined by today's prediction. However, they are unable to teach us how to coexist with the earth or how to transmit that knowledge through songs, stories, and signs. We have mostly forgotten what the ancients knew, that being a part of the weather is more important for survival than simply understanding it. Julius Caesar was the most powerful and possibly the most dangerous man in the Roman world by the year 44 BCE. He behaved like a king, even though he wasn't born one. Cunning, military prowess, and just the perfect amount of merciless charm had enabled him to soar from a bankrupt aristocrat to the pinnacle of Roman politics. The conquest of Gaul, his most notable military triumph, transformed him from a well-liked general into a living war god. Caesar had commanded Roman armies across what is now France, Belgium, and parts of Germany for almost 10 years, accumulating unfathomable wealth and devoted followers who would accompany him into the underworld upon request. Caesar did not resign quietly in 49 BCE when the Senate attempted to remove him from power. In a genuine act of treason, he marched against Rome after crossing the Rubicon River. It was the irreversible point. He defeated his rival Pompey in the civil war that followed, dispersed the Senate's army, and ultimately returned to Rome as a ruler as well as a victor. Traditionalists squirmed when he was given the title Dictator Perpetuo, or Dictator in Perpetuity. This was more than a short-term emergency solution. The issue was that this was permanent. Caesar started to change the state after he regained control. He packed the Senate with supporters while also expanding it. He provided citizenship to foreigners, lowered debts, and reorganized the calendar into what would become the Julian system. He moved swiftly and decisively, slicing like a sword through the outdated bureaucracy. He was a hero to the general populace, a warning signal to the Senate elite. As Caesar strolled through Rome wearing a purple toga, a color only nobility could wear, they watched with anxiety. When he sat by himself on a golden chair in front of the Senate, they grimaced. Statues rose. His face appeared on coins. He was proclaimed a living god by priests. Mark Antony even handed him a crown at a public feast. Caesar paused dramatically before refusing. The symptoms were obvious to his adversaries. Julius Caesar was doing more than merely concentrating power. He was establishing the foundations of monarchy. Nearly 500 years had passed since Rome had toppled kings, and now it appeared that the Republic was poised to undergo a rebirth as something darker, crowned, and irrevocable. Caesar's foes were honing their blades, first metaphorically and then practically, while he reveled in his splendor. Whispers of dissatisfaction became tangible plans in the smoky corners of pubs and the marbled halls of Roman palaces. Caesar's consolidation of power did not seem like reform to many senators. Tyranny was in place. Roman tradition also allowed for the removal of dictators indefinitely. The political fringes were not the source of the conspiracy. It originated with the Roman aristocracy. Gaius Cassius Longinus, a seasoned general and a fierce opponent of Caesar's centralization, led the charge. However, the conspirators' true target was someone much more symbolic, Brutus Marcus Junius. Brutus wasn't a wild fringe figure, known for his stoicism and widespread respect. He was descended from Lucius Junius Brutus, who had assisted in the overthrow of Rome's last monarch centuries before. It wouldn't be considered treason if Brutus joined the conspiracy. It would be customary. Brutus hesitated at first. Caesar had even treated him like a surrogate son and pardoned him for supporting Pompey during the civil war. However, their intimacy only made Brutus's internal strife worse. Did allegiance to Caesar take precedence over allegiance to Rome? Cassius expertly capitalized on the tension by giving Brutus just enough remorse, reason, and flattery to tip the scales. More than 60 senators, including those who had once been Caesar's favorites, made up the core conspiracy group by early March. Some were motivated by personal grievances or a fear of losing power, while others were motivated by philosophy. However, they shared a common belief: the Republic could not withstand Caesar's rule because he had gone too far. They started holding covert meetings at temples and private residences to discuss the strategy, the time, and above all, the message. In a few weeks, Caesar was scheduled to depart Rome for a campaign in Parthia. They feared that he would either never return or return with far more authority if they didn't take action quickly. The window was shutting. Although it would be dangerous, a public assassination would also have symbolic value. And where better to hold the Senate's March meeting than the theatre of Pompey? March 15th. Instead of swords, they opted for daggers. Their only advantages would be speed and surprise. The plotters were prepared. They assured themselves that the Republic would be spared. They had no idea that they were going to plunge it into civil war, bloodshed, and mayhem. The Ides of March morning, March 15th, 44 BCE, started out like any other, with the exception that Rome itself appeared agitated. There were many rumors in the air. They had reported strange omens, animals acting strangely, storms and spectral apparitions. Later reports claim that Caesar's own wife, Calpurnia, pleaded with him not to attend the Senate meeting that day because she was having nightmares about his assassination. He truly listened for a second. He remained at home. However, pride or fate had other ideas. Decimus Brutus, not to be confused with Marcus, one of the conspirators, showed up at Caesar's house and convinced him to change his mind. He reassured Caesar that the Senate was prepared to confer additional honors and that it would appear conceited or cowardly to miss the session. Ever mindful of his image, Caesar gave in. The Senate was temporarily convened there, escorted by a Pompey. A message alerting him to the scheme was handed to him, but he never read it. Unaware that almost every senator in the chamber had a dagger concealed beneath his toga, the guy was entering his own funeral. The conspirators began to move as Caesar stepped into the Senate chamber. They assembled around him, claiming to be bringing a petition. The first to strike was Lucius Tullius Cimber, who grabbed Caesar's toga and pulled it down. The signal was that Servilius Casca delivered the first knife, clumsy and off-target. Caesar reportedly exclaimed, "What are you doing, Casca, you villain?" before recognizing it was an ambush rather than a single attack. Then came more blades. He was surrounded by senators who stabbed him indiscriminately, striking Caesar and sometimes one another. The violence had started to rage. Caesar received 23 stab wounds in total, but only one of them, likely the one to the chest, was lethal. Legend has it that when he saw Brutus among the attackers, he did not fight back. Et tu, Brute, his purported final words. Brutus, you too. Despite conflicting ancient records regarding whether he said anything at all, they have become folklore. According to some, he just silently and dignifiedly pulled his toga over his face. At the feet of a statue of his former adversary Pompey the Great, Julius Caesar lay lifeless after the blood had stopped flowing. It was a strange turn of events. They had killed the tyrant. They had exacted revenge on the Republic. The assassins believed that. The conspirators thought they had preserved the Republic when Julius Caesar's bloody body hit the Senate floor. They anticipated cheers, a party, an appreciative Senate, and perhaps a statue or two dedicated to them. Instead, they experienced panic. A startled quiet descended upon the hall as Caesar's lifeless body lay crumpled beneath the statue of Pompey. Then there was an uproar. A few senators ran away in fear, not knowing who might be the next to be targeted. Others remained motionless, uncertain whether to applaud or lament. Still holding their daggers, the assassins lifted their bloodied hands and proclaimed that they had freed Rome from oppression. However, the reaction was much more harmful and much colder outside the chamber. Caesar was adored by the Roman populace. He was the one who had promised them land and citizenship, provided them with entertainment, and fed them. He was more than a monarch. He was a symbol of populism. And now he had been slaughtered in broad daylight by a group of elites, many of whom had profited from his rule in the past. There were only blades and treachery, no trial or ceremony. The crowd started to become agitated. The conspirators were greeted with glares and whispered threats when they came out expecting applause. Not even Caesar's adversaries knew how to react. What to do next was unclear to the Republicans. There was only a political void, no blueprint, no governing council, and no succession. Fearing reprisals, the conspirators withdrew to the Capitoline Hill in the hours after the murder. Caesar's longtime loyalist and co-consul, Mark Antony, acted quickly to bring the situation under control. He was not involved in the plot, although being aware of the tensions, and he now occupied one of Rome's most important positions. An uncomfortable truce was mediated by Antony. Caesar's laws and appointments would be upheld in return for the Senate not punishing the assassins. The masses were not calmed by the careful agreement that was intended to avoid civil war. All it did was postpone the explosion. Unexpected information was revealed when Caesar's will was opened. Gaius Octavius, later known as Augustus, was his grandnephew whom he had posthumously adopted as his successor. His lavish gifts to the Roman populace were even more combustible. The populace was in grief. Two ambitious men, Antony and Octavian, were poised to use Caesar's death as a weapon, but the assassins had no plan. A man had been slain by the Ides of March. However, it had sparked a much more terrible conflict that would destroy Rome. If the Roman populace was taken aback by Caesar's murder, they were incensed at his funeral. The city came together to mourn their deceased leader at the Forum just a few days after the Ides of March. Caesar's body was on display in front of the temple of Venus Genetrix, his purported divine ancestor, in a gilded coffin that was covered in purple and gold. Now that he was firmly established as Caesar's political heir, Mark Antony took the stage to give one of the most well-known speeches in Roman history. It wasn't nuanced. Antony's grief was not limited to Caesar. He acted out grief. As he read Caesar's testament to the assembly, he disclosed that the autocrat had bequeathed enormous public gardens and 300 sesterces to every Roman citizen from his private estates. People were in disbelief. Caesar was taking care of them even in death. He was a man of the people, even in death. The stakes were then increased by Antony. As though reading aloud an accusation of treachery, he pulled Caesar's blood-stained toga, ripped it open to reveal the stab wounds, and gestured to each cut. According to some historical accounts, he even displayed Caesar's body, transforming the funeral into a violent street play. Already irate, the crowd grew much more so. What started off as a rite of sorrow now descended into a full-scale riot. The populace hurried through the streets, took timber and benches from nearby structures, and erected a temporary fire in the Forum. Chaos broke out as Caesar's body was burned. In an effort to set the conspirators' houses on fire, the crowd turned against them. Only swift escapes or military protection were able to save several. Rome was about to fall into civil unrest. Now that they were obviously out of favor, the conspirators realized their worst nightmare. No tyrant had been slain by them. A legend had been martyred. With his popularity soaring, Antony emerged from the funeral as the de facto head of the city. Caesar's youthful successor, Octavian, was stealthily traveling to Rome to retrieve what had been given to him while the Senate hesitated and the populace roared. The Republic had not been calmed by the burial. A firestorm had been sparked by it. It had been an execution on the Ides of March. The funeral, however, the revolution was sparked by that. Even though Caesar was no longer alive, his legacy endured forever. It was armed now, too. The majority of people did not take the adolescent seriously when Julius Caesar named Gaius Octavius as his adoptive son and heir in his will. He was only 18, unproven, bookish, and ill. He lacked a Senate seat, an army, and actual political influence. To put it briefly, he didn't appear to be a threat. Rome would soon discover, however, that Octavian was more than merely Caesar's namesake. In every way, he was the spiritual heir to Caesar. Octavian had been studying in Apollonia, present-day Albania, at the time of the death in order to accompany Caesar on his next Parthian expedition. He behaved remarkably quickly and clearly after learning of the crime. He sailed directly to Italy and marched toward Rome, disregarding safety advice. As Caesar's son, not as a general, he seized the legacy right away, both politically and emotionally, though not legally yet. When he first arrived in Rome, he emphasized his relationship to the dead dictator by referring to himself as Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. Although he lacked authority, his name was enough to arouse suspicion in Rome. Claiming the 300 million sesterces Caesar left in his will was Octavian's first move. Conveniently, Mark Antony was taking his time releasing the money. Still reeling from the spectacle of Antony's funeral, the Senate started to view Octavian as a possible counterbalance. Ever the thinker, Octavian fulfilled Caesar's pledges and gained the affection of the populace by offering to compensate the citizens with money he had borrowed. He then started wooing Caesar's soldiers. These were seasoned men who had served in the Civil War and fought throughout Gaul. After their admiration for Caesar, they now saw his kid as the next big thing. They were promised land, money, and retribution by Octavian. His network of support gradually expanded. In the meantime, Mark Antony was gaining more authority while also alienating people, especially in the Senate. There was simmering tension between Antony and Octavian. Rome proved to be too small to accommodate Caesar's two legacies. In an attempt to exploit the young Octavian as a blunt tool to force Antony back into line, the Senate, ever opportunistic, started to shift its favor in his favor. Because Octavian was more than just a sad heir, they undervalued him. He was a political genius who was also extremely cruel, patient, and cunning. Additionally, Octavian favored protracted games and quiet agreements, whereas Antony enjoyed fanfare and drama. Rome's power structure was going to be redrawn by the youngster that no one took seriously. Rome sped toward another power reckoning as tensions flared in the wake of Caesar's murder. In their Cold War, Mark Antony and Octavian were vying for Caesar's throne, amassing troops and figuring out how to govern a republic that was on the verge of collapse. However, neither man was yet able to do it alone. Caesar's former horseman and seasoned general Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, the third pillar that has been forgotten, enters the scene. Lepidus led legions and ruled over portions of Spain and Gaul, while being less charismatic than Antony or Octavian. The second triumvirate was a political agreement made by Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus during a period of unsettling pragmatism. In contrast to the unofficial coalition formed by Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus years before, this one was formally recognized by the Senate, granted broad authority to bring about order, and sanctioned by law. In actuality, it was a recognized autocracy that was shared by three extremely driven men with vastly disparate objectives. Their very first business venture? Retaliation. A violent purging of political rivals was initiated by the triumvirs. They created lists of prescriptions, senators' names, stocks, and the identities of everybody they thought may be against them. They weren't trials, they were executions. Rome's streets were filled with blood, families were destroyed, and land was seized, Not even Cicero, the well-known orator and vocal opponent of Antony, was exempt. Cicero had favored him above Antony, but Octavian permitted his inclusion on the list. Loyalty was surpassed by pragmatism. However, the actual target, the assassins of Cassius, Brutus, and Julius Caesar, remained unattainable. Following the assassination, both had fled east and were assembling their own armies with the help of provincial governors and republican adherents. The defenders of the Republic were getting ready to make a last fight against Caesar's descendants. The triumvirs retaliated by assembling their soldiers. Lepidus was left to rule Rome as Octavian, and Antony marched east. Where are they going? The Macedonian city of Philippi. Cracks were already visible, but the Republic and Caesar's legacy were on the verge of a full-scale civil war. The only thing that bound the triumvirs together was their common enemy. Everyone understood that the knives would be drawn anew as soon as those adversaries were defeated. Rome was preparing for the next round, not recuperating. With swords, alliances, and betrayals rather than laws or reform, the Republic was dying. The die is cast as Caesar had forewarned. The delicate Republic was put to the ultimate test in 42 BCE on the northern Greek plain of Philippi. The two main conspirators in Caesar's murder, Brutus and Cassius, were on one side. With the support of Republican senators and sympathizers in the provinces, they now led a combined army of almost 100,000 soldiers. On the opposing side, the armies of Mark Antony and Octavian, the second triumvirate, were brought together by ambition and retaliation. There were enormous stakes. This was about the essence of Rome, not simply Caesar anymore. The advantages of numbers and position belonged to Cassius and Brutus. They sought to outlast their adversaries and fortified high ground. The more experienced general Antony, however, showed aggression and cunning. The first engagement occurred on October 3rd. Cassius's defenses were breached by Antony's army. Cassius immediately killed himself with the same sword he had used against Caesar, since he thought Brutus had also lost. However, Brutus persisted for a few more weeks. The second fight started on October 23rd. Now, vastly outnumbered and without Cassius, Brutus made a last fight. Despite his men's heroic efforts, Antony's cavalry outran them. Brutus withdrew and, like his accomplice, committed suicide when his army disintegrated. "Virtue, you were just a name," he said in his parting remarks, a mixture of duty and remorse. Brutus's passing signified the Roman Republic's symbolic demise. He was interred with the principles of senatorial rule, checks and balances, and shared governance. Following the triumph at Philippi, Octavian and Antony became the new rulers of Rome. However, their relationship, which was already based more on necessity than trust, started to deteriorate right away. Antony stayed in the east and became closer to Egypt's queen Cleopatra. After his return to Rome, Octavian solidified his position of authority and positioned himself as the champion of Roman principles. Back in the city, Octavian reformed the Senate, pushed land reforms to appease Caesar's veterans, and established himself as the more steady, more composed voice, in contrast to Antony's far-flung adventures. The dream of the old republic had come to an end, but the civil wars had not. Those with allegiance and army leadership now had political authority, and the Senate was a shadow of its former self. The murder of one guy had caused a whole system to fall apart. Brutus and Cassius were not the only people buried on the battlefield of Philippi. The Republic itself was buried. Rome was in the shaky hands of two victors, Octavian and Mark Antony, after Brutus and Cassius were killed, and the Republic was in ruins. But if the Romans had learned anything from history, it was this: power is never shared for very long. The second triad initially stumbled forward. Lepidus was forced into political obscurity, while Antony dominated the east, and Octavian dominated the west. Despite their outward displays of cooperation, the two main adversaries were vying for complete control. Alexandria, Egypt, rather than Rome, was the tipping point. Antony had developed a romantic and political relationship with Egypt's ambitious and powerful queen, Cleopatra VII. This romance was more than scandalous to many in Rome. Treason was committed. There were rumors that Antony planned to declare Cleopatra the Queen of Rome and split the Roman Empire among her offspring. True or not, Octavian took advantage of the situation. He began an unrelenting propaganda effort, presenting Antony as a man corrupted by wealth, tempted by the East, and determined to destroy Roman customs. Cleopatra was portrayed as an alien seductress who was controlling Rome's fate from a distance. The Senate supported Octavian because they were anxious and wanted to support stability. The Battle of Actium, a naval engagement off the western coast of Greece in 31 BCE, pitted the two titans against one another. Antony's fleet was outmaneuvered by Agrippa, Octavian's general. The outcome? A disastrous loss. After fleeing to Egypt, Antony and Cleopatra killed themselves there a year later. The last barrier has vanished. Octavian came back to Rome as something fresh, not merely a winner. He ostensibly returned powers to the Senate in 27 BCE, but they promptly gave him unheard-of power. Augustus, which translates to the revered one, was the title bestowed upon him. It was a brilliant move. He subtly became the Republic's emperor, in all but name, while seemingly restoring it. The Roman Empire was born. During his more than 4 decades in power, Augustus brought stability, wealth, and a meticulously manicured image of peace. However, the truth was concealed beneath that facade. On the Ides of March, Caesar and the Republic had both perished. The result was transformation rather than rebirth. Instead of restoring liberty, the daggers had paved the way for monarchy. Rome will never be the same after Caesar's blood fertilized the ground from which an empire arose. In 1543, Tokugawa Ieyasu was born as Matsudaira Takechio, a youngster born into chaos. Japan was in the midst of the Sengoku Jidai, or Warring States era, when daimyo, or regional rulers, fought for control of a divided nation. Overnight, alliances changed, treachery was commonplace, and violence was the norm. Takechio was surrounded by adversaries from the moment he was born, since he was born into the Mikawa province-based Matsudaira clan, a minor aristocratic family. The Oda clan to the west and the Imagawa clan to the east were the Matsudaira's two very competitive and strong neighbors. Takechio's family decided to obtain safety through surrender because they lacked the strength to stand on their own. The boy was taken as a political captive to the Imagawa at the age of 6, essentially serving as a living vow of allegiance. However, things took a tragic turn. The boy was taken by the Oda when they stopped the caravan on its way to the Imagawa court. Oda Nobuhide, the father of future ruler Oda Nobunaga, ruled over young Takechio for the next 2 years. He was given some consideration, but he was still a prisoner and a negotiating chip. He was eventually given to Imagawa Yoshimoto, who reared him as a noble captive following discussions and exchanges. However, Takechio was fashioned by his confinement rather than broken by it. He received instruction in the art of battle, diplomacy, martial arts, and ancient Chinese literature under the Imagawa. Most importantly, he learned how to wait, how to read people, and how to communicate carefully. He discovered the importance of placement and patience, while other boys aspired to glory. He was remembered even though he was officially a hostage. The little boy was the nominal head of the Matsudaira clan after his father passed away in 1549, but he would not have any independence for years. He started to exhibit traits of the guy he would grow up to be, even in his teens: silent, methodical, and always observing. His early years were characterized by survival rather than freedom. And that may have been the best schooling of all, in a time when the hot-headed were promptly disposed of. One day, all of Japan would belong to the boy who was passed from hand to hand. Matsudaira Takechiyo, who would later become Tokugawa Ieyasu, was no longer only a political pawn by the time he was in his early teens. He was still officially a hostage of the Imagawa clan, but as a young warrior he had started to gain respect. He diligently practiced archery, horseback riding, and swordsmanship. He researched governance, court etiquette, and strategy. He had his coming-of-age ceremony and adopted the name Matsudaira Motoyasu in 1556 when he was 13 years old. New duties and the authority to command troops into combat accompanied the new moniker. Motoyasu was given command of minor military missions by the Imagawa because they had enough faith in him. Despite his young, he exhibited a rare blend of composure, caution, and discipline. He didn't pursue fame by making careless accusations. He favored taking decisive action after careful planning. It was experience, not myth, that taught him the art of combat, and experience came with blood in Sengoku, Japan. Motoyasu strengthened his ties to the Imagawa clan in 1557 when he wed the daughter of an ally, Sekiguchi Chikanaga. Nevertheless, he never lost sight of his origins despite playing the devoted retainer. Although Imagawa was officially in charge of his Mikawa province, he maintained connections with local vassals and retainers who yearned for autonomy. Motoyasu would wait, as he had always done. The Battle of Okehazama in 1560 was the turning point. Confident of his increasing strength, Imagawa Yoshimoto began a bold westward invasion with the goal of capturing Oda land. With pomp and circumstance, the Imagawa army marched in the hopes of winning easily. However, Yoshimoto and his troops were wiped out when young Oda Nobunaga, a little-known warlord at the time, launched a surprise attack during a thunderstorm. It was a seismic shock. Overnight, the Imagawa were beheaded. Motoyasu and other vassals were left defenseless and without a leader. Rather than panicking, however, Motoyasu took action. He silently declared independence after seizing control of Okazaki Castle, the ancient home of his family. He was a rising daimyo in his own right when he returned to Mikawa, not as a hostage. It was the first significant step toward authority. After serving under a failing administration and surviving hostage situations, he has now become a prominent figure in his own right. Tokugawa Ieyasu's cautious ascent had started. Matsudaira Motoyasu, now claiming his independence, found himself at a precarious juncture following the collapse of the Imagawa clan following the Battle of Okehazama. His small Mikawa kingdom was open to larger ravenous neighbors as well as internal insurrection. He didn't panic, though. He looked to Oda Nobunaga, the man who had recently overthrown his previous overlord, as an unexpected friend. Motoyasu and Nobunaga negotiated a formal alliance in 1561. The words were straightforward: mutual military assistance and respect for one another's independence. Motoyasu even repeated the traumatic procedure he had gone through as a kid by sending his son Tokugawa Hidetada to the Oda court as a political hostage as a gesture of goodwill. In Sengoku, Japan, it served as a reminder of how brittle and transactional alliances were. Motoyasu changed his name to Tokugawa Ieyasu to commemorate this new phase of his life. The transformation wasn't merely aesthetic. It gave his authority legitimacy and a sense of destiny by tying him to a noble and old heritage. It was a well-planned action. Though it was still a dream at this time, the Tokugawa name would reverberate throughout history. Ieyasu developed his strength throughout the course of the following 20 years. Ieyasu adopted a more cautious strategy, while Nobunaga grew quickly, destroying rival clans and transforming central Japan with steel and fire. He concentrated on modernizing his army, calming dissident vassals, enacting land reforms, and uniting Mikawa. His government placed a strong emphasis on discipline, loyalty, and gradual progress. Despite their temperamental differences, Ieyasu was cautious and strategic, while Nobunaga was brazen and violent. The alliance remained strong. Ieyasu participated in crucial battles like Mikitagahara and Nagashino, and aided Nobunaga in his efforts against formidable foes like the Takeda clan. However, things weren't always easy. There was always friction between their goals, simmering beneath the surface. Nobunaga was a man who demanded loyalty and ate up his opponents. Conversely, Ieyasu was quietly constructing, anticipating a chance to ascend onto his own terms. During the notorious event at Honnoji in 1582, a disgruntled vassal named Akechi Mitsuhide betrayed Nobunaga and compelled him to commit suicide. With Nobunaga gone, Japan has lost its centralized authority once more. Ieyasu took his time entering. He backed off, rearranged, and observed. As usual, he would wait for the ideal moment to strike, but the pieces on the board were moving. The power struggle restarted after Oda Nobunaga's death left Japan in a state of uncertainty. However, Toyotomi Hideyoshi was the one commander and warlord who moved more quickly and brutally than the others. As the new de facto ruler of central Japan, Hideyoshi quickly filled the power vacuum and exacted revenge on his master within days of Nobunaga's murder. Still recuperating and establishing himself in Mikawa, Tokugawa Ieyasu decided against taking on Hideyoshi head-on. He was aware that the timing was off. He lacked the national backing required to contend with someone with Hideyoshi's momentum, although having the strength and the drive. Rather, he adapted, which is what he always did best. Tensions between them ultimately reached a boiling point in 1584 during the Battle of Komaki and Nagakuti. Ieyasu took a direct military stance against Hideyoshi for the first time. Ieyasu's soldiers achieved a tactical victory, but the conflict came to a standstill. Both sides chose to engage in diplomacy rather than carry on the expensive war. Ieyasu consented to formally become Hideyoshi's subordinate, but he retained his independence. Ieyasu executed the delicate balancing act flawlessly. Ieyasu worked under Hideyoshi for the following 10 years, appearing faithful on the outside but remaining distant at all times. Ieyasu subtly improved his personal standing, while Hideyoshi concentrated on grandiose endeavors like the Kyushu and Odawara campaigns and eventually the catastrophic invasions of Korea. He moved his base to Edo, present-day Tokyo, restructured his kingdom into a stronghold of future ambition, and extended his power throughout the Kanto region. Ieyasu also closely monitored Hideyoshi's ambitions for succession. Hideyori was born in 1593, scarcely a child, and Hideyoshi had no adult heir. Ieyasu, who saw the long term, positioned himself as a dependable elder statesman who would be there to assist the Toyotomi family when the time came. Actually, he was preparing the way for a future coup. A council of 5 regents was left in charge after Hideyoshi's death in 1598 until Hideyori reached adulthood. Among them was Ieyasu, who was by far the most powerful. While others flamed out in glory, he had waited, obeyed, and lived. The patient man from Mikawa now stood alone among giants, poised to strike, as the old guard faded into legend. It was almost time for the last act of unity. When Toyotomi Hideyoshi passed away in 1598, Japan began a new period of uncertainty. A council of 5 regents, made up of influential daimyo, had been formed to protect his legacy, and his little son, Hideyori, was only 5 years old. Tokugawa Ieyasu, however, was not interested in serving as a nursemaid to a different man's dynasty. Ieyasu quickly established his dominance. He began openly disregarding the council's rulings, fortified connections, and married off his daughters to influential daimyo households. As more lords started to support the Tokugawa, the balance of power gradually changed before abruptly shifting. Everyone understood that Ieyasu was not only the most senior of the regents, but also the richest and most politically astute. Ishida Mitsunari, a Toyotomi supporter and a court official with no combat experience but a lot of ambition, was backed by opposition in the meantime. Ishida rallied daimyo to defend the Toyotomi heritage after accusing Ieyasu of breaking Hideyoshi's will. Many of these lords were more afraid of Ieyasu than they were of Hideyori. They drew line. Japan was on the verge of civil war once more. Ishida attempted to defeat Tokugawa before he could fully organize in 1600 by launching a preemptive strike. Ever patient, Ieyasu had expected this. Ishida led the Western Army, and he organized supporters under what would be called the Eastern Army. It would turn out to be the biggest and most important combat in Japanese history, involving about 160,000 troops. Ieyasu, however, had one more tool: deceit. He engaged in covert negotiations with Ishida's daimyo, such as Kobayakawa Hideaki, who was offered lands and benefits in return for betraying him. The future of Japan on the eve of the war would depend not only on swords, but also on who could be persuaded to change sides at the appropriate time. Few could foresee what the following day would bring as the soldiers assembled in Sekigahara near a foggy crossroads. It was a last stand for tradition for some. Others saw it as merely another civil war. For Ieyasu, however, it was the result of 60 years of strategy, sacrifice, and survival. If he prevailed here, the goal of a united Japan under his leadership, one he had subtly fostered since childhood, would at last come true. The last roaring deed of Japan's Civil War era took place on the foggy plains of Sekigahara on October 20th, 1600. There were more than 160,000 soldiers spread out on the battlefield, with Ishida Mitsunari's Western Army and Tokugawa Ieyasu's Eastern Army battling it out. The future of Japan was at stake and nothing less. Ever the planner, Ieyasu had carefully positioned his forces, setting up reliable friends at strategic locations and securing his lines along a ridge. However, his true strategy was not based solely on strategy. With offers of land and titles, he had been discreetly talking with several of Ishida's officers for weeks. Kobayakawa Hideaki was the most crucial of them all, and his treachery would tip the scales. The ruthless start was marked by bursts of gunfire and showers of arrows as the morning mist cleared. There was no obvious winner in the bloody battle between the two forces. The conflict raged for hours, with samurai engaged in frantic, desperate dueling and blood saturating the fields. Ieyasu held his composure and awaited the moment he had planned. It was early in the afternoon when it happened. Still sitting on the sidelines alongside thousands of soldiers, Kobayakawa had not made a commitment. Exasperated, Ieyasu gave the command for his musketeers to open fire on his position. As a wake-up call, not an attack, it was an obvious message: be quick or you'll be crushed. Kobayakawa took the initiative. His troops unexpectedly turned against the Western Army and struck Ishida's men in the flank. The impact was terrible and instantaneous. Cohesion collapsed, panic grew, and other faltering commanders followed suit. A combat that had been evenly matched descended into carnage. Ishida escaped, but was apprehended shortly after. Many of his supporters were found and put to death. Those that survived were either compelled to surrender to Tokugawa power or lose their lands. The Eastern Army had won by timing, cunning, and sheer psychological strength, in addition to sheer numbers. The final nail in the coffin of the shattered Sengoku era, the victory at Sekigahara, was more than just a military triumph. Ieyasu had vanquished his final formidable opponents. In addition to winning a war, he took over Japan. He was no longer forced to wait. After much struggle, the throne of power was finally his. Making it official was the only thing left to do, and Ieyasu, patient as usual, was prepared to use his unwavering authority to transform Japan into something new. Tokugawa Ieyasu gained practical, but not yet legal, dominance over Japan after the Battle of Sekigahara. He worked covertly behind the scenes for 2 years, allocating fiefs, reorganizing power, and rewarding loyalty while punishing disobedience. He got rid of his most threatening opponents. The knee was bent by the rest. Ieyasu was aware, however, that military superiority was insufficient on its own. He required credibility. The ultimate payoff arrived in 1603. Ieyasu was officially named Sei Taishogun, barbarian subduing great general, by the emperor in Kyoto when he was 60 years old. Centuries before, Minamoto no Yoritomo had held the same title. However, in contrast to his predecessors, Ieyasu had no plans to stand aside. Now he had not waited 60 years to release him. The shogunate of Tokugawa came into being. Ieyasu established Edo, a fishing village he had converted into a military and administrative center, as his capital instead of Kyoto, the symbolic center of the imperial court. For the next 250 years, Edo, or present-day Tokyo, would be the center of power. Ieyasu quickly established a control infrastructure. He constructed a rigid social structure that restricted people's mobility and confined them into their positions as samurai, peasants, artisans, and merchants. He also established a centralized administration and stationed trusted vassals in strategic areas. Every daimyo was aware of who was observing, and every class knew where they belonged. The Sankinkutai system, one of Ieyasu's most ingenious systems, obliged daimyo to spend alternating years in Edo and return home to their family as virtual captives. Through regular travel and infrastructure upkeep, it boosted the economy while draining their coffers and averting rebellion. However, Ieyasu's efforts went beyond economic and political change. Additionally, he suppressed religion, particularly Christianity, which he saw to be an unstable alien influence. Persecution intensified, churches were demolished, and missions were banished. At a time when internal peace was being established, Japan would become more and more isolated from the outside world. Ieyasu will abdicate in 1605, transferring the title to his son Hidetada, although becoming shogun formally. However, the action was merely symbolic. He continued to be the real force behind the scenes, guaranteeing a seamless changeover and establishing Tokugawa supremacy. He had been waiting for the throne all his life. More power than any emperor had ever possessed, he now governed from the shadows. There was no warlord left. A statesman was establishing an empire in his stead. One threat persisted despite Tokugawa Ieyasu's claim to the shogunship and its transfer to his son, a kid born under the previous government. The late Hideyoshi's son, Toyotomi Hideyori, had reached adulthood and might serve as a focal point for those who remained devoted to the Toyotomi tradition. He resided in Osaka Castle, Japan's most powerful stronghold, which was encircled by an expanding network of anti-Tokugawa groups. Ieyasu, who is currently retired but remains the shogunate's true power, regarded this with a great deal of skepticism. Hideyori had not engaged in any overt acts of rebellion in public, but there were rumors. Samurai who were dissatisfied went to Osaka. Weapons and supplies were kept in store at the castle. Political maneuvering was alluded to in messages sent to other domains. Ieyasu made his decision quickly. It was necessary to permanently neutralize Hideyori. In what is now known as the Winter Campaign, the Tokugawa gathered an army of more than 200,000 soldiers in 1614 and encircled Osaka. Encouraged by his mother Yodogimi, Hideyori resisted vehemently. Even the shogunate's forces suffered damage while the defenders held. A peace pact was eventually mediated. After Osaka filled in, it appeared that the threat had ended. Ieyasu wasn't done, though. He used the accusation that Hideyori had broken the armistice by rebuilding defenses as an excuse to restart fighting in 1615. There will be no respite this time when the summer campaign got underway. The castle was pounded by cannon fire when Tokugawa forces overran its outer defenses. As Osaka Castle burnt around them during the final fight, Toyotomi Hideyori and his mother killed themselves. Once powerful, the Toyotomi family was destroyed by fire. The final significant danger to Tokugawa power has vanished. By the end of the siege, Ieyasu had fully united Japan, not just politically and militarily, but also symbolically. No more surviving allegiances to former administrations, no more conflicting heirs. Standing lonesome on the ashes of the Sengoku realm was the Tokugawa. He had buried the final offspring of chaos beneath the remains of a once impenetrable stronghold, outlived his adversaries, and outwitted rivals. The lesson was obvious. Japan would not have a second act for civil war, not while the system of Tokugawa Ieyasu remained in place. Tokugawa Ieyasu passed away in 1616 at the age of 73, which is an impressive age for someone who had endured decades of conflict, treachery, and political scheming. On the contrary, ambiguity was not a result of his passing. Ieyasu had created one of the most stable regimes in Japanese history, and his system was still operating smoothly after his death. He had already been succeeded as shogun by his son Hidetada, and his grandson Ieyasu was being prepared to succeed him. Ieyasu made sure that the Tokugawa dynasty would endure through institutions rather than just individuals, in contrast to the brittle lines of the Minamoto or Ashikaga before him. Swords were no longer used to convey power. Instead, alliances, legacy, and regulations did. After being buried in Kunozan Toshogu, Ieyasu was later reburied at Nikko, where he was worshipped as the great incarnation of the light of the East, Tosho Daigongan. In his honor, a large, elaborate shrine was built, which is now among Japan's holiest sites. He became a god and a representation of longevity, order, and iron discipline, in addition to being recognized as a shogun. Japan entered the Edo period, more than 250 years of comparatively calm and stable conditions, under his successors. Christianity was banned, outside influence was severely curtailed, trade was restricted, social classes were frozen in place, and the nation was essentially cut off by the Sakoku, or national isolation, policy. It was tranquility, but not freedom. Once fearsome warriors, the samurai now work as administrators and bureaucrats. A distinct culture of literature, ukiyo-e art, kabuki theater, and rigorous etiquette developed as cities expanded and agriculture prospered. Ieyasu had transformed a war-torn, divided country into a centralized hierarchical state that tightly controlled all facets of society. However, the lesson he imparted, patience wins empires, may have been his greatest contribution rather than the empire he established. Ieyasu used strategy to rule, but Nobunaga used fire and Hideyoshi used charm. He did not gamble or hurry. When the time arrived, he attacked and didn't let go after waiting and observing. Once a hostage, the kid would go on to become the undisputed architect of Japan's longest peace, passing from warlord to warlord. His impact changed a country, and his life was a masterclass in self-control.